Hello everyone, today we talk very briefly about Palmyran archers, the significance of archery in Palmyran army. That's something that we never really discussed up to now. You know, what was the role of Palmyra, especially in the crisis of the 3rd century. They conquered Roman Syria, Palestine and Egypt. So basically some of the most, and the majority actually, the most populated, richest areas of, in fact, the eastern provinces. Eventually, this around 268-70, right, across time, and the Romans would defeat with Aurelian in around 272-273 Palmyra. That's said to have been destroyed, but as a matter of fact, it actually continued to stand as a city. There is no evidence of major destruction. It kept being a fortress under Diocletian specifically, and it's a very fascinating community, as the many that had existed in the Roman Empire. You know, the city had been integrated in 17 AD, incorporated in the autonomous province of Roman Syria, right? And in 129, because of the important contribution of auxiliary troops to the Romans, it had acquired the status of free city, and henceforth it improved dramatically its situation. That was a very good one, in a sense. It was located amidst 3 continents, right, on the major trade routes between east and west, in part also from north and south. Basically, it stood, you know, this oasis, right, in between Arabia and Syria, and you know, properly the Mediterranean and Iran, right. It stood as properly as a power on its own. They had been capable of defeating around 260 the Sasanian invasion of Roman Syria, which is something that, if you think about, of course, you know, things shouldn't seem like, you know, David versus Goliath. There were, you know, certain broader difficulties in the mess that was unleashed in the region around in the same years. Instability from which the same Palmyrans profited. That, however, manifests this important power of the Palmyran armies that have been counted sometimes around with 10,000 horsemen, of which 1/10 cataphracts, and a portion of them properly what were called klibanari, with a, you know, here there is a huge debate about terminology, but in practice, you know, a fully armored horse and horsemen, and the rest of lighter cavalry being composed by horse archers. And archery, in this regard, was important in the area. As you know, Syria, Lebanon, those areas became historically, not just in the ancient world, but in the later one, also a bit stereotypically the seats of these more skilled archers, right? This Eastern tradition of composite bows that evolved around the centuries, we can already find here, such as the Irtzi bow that's been found in this area, scimitarral area, from which it takes the name. It's dated between the 1st century BC, the 3rd century AD, more or less in the same eras. We are not dramatically documented about the Palmyran army. Basically, we rely mostly on this beautiful iconographic evidence is left in Palmyra, because, you know, as you know, the recent destructions by ISIS and so on, in part, fortunately, have spared. But much actually has been lost of it, unfortunately, and criminally, by the way. That give us pretty good idea of what, especially armor, was about in this context. We'll talk about the Palmyran army more comprehensively at some point. But it's important to stress properly the political and military autonomy of this center and its concrete capacities, because its manpower was limited in a way. It was just a city, after all, in the midst of, not really of nowhere, but almost, that could rely on this local resources and a political reach that could mobilize also other, essentially other communities. Palmyra stood in the midst of an area essentially composed of 4 districts. It was fundamentally a Semitic area. If you want to distinguish between Syrians and Arabs, it seems to have been properly more of an Arab thing than else. But as we've seen, was importantly connected to the in the picture, even given the temples, the architecture, etc. Many people say, well, this was a typically Hellenistic center, right? Heavily Hellenized society. This, from the description of their army, it's not entirely true, right? It's obvious that, I don't know, even the Romans were an Hellenistic power, if you want. But if you look at the proper, for example, the vests of the nobility, as we've seen, the appearance of the soldiers, etc., we can spot not just an Arab influence, of course, but more importantly, a Persian one. Right, the Palmyrans came to recruit troops as far as central Iran, right, and they were, as we've seen, fundamentally designed to cope mostly with Persian troops. We remember the Palmyrans as enemies of Rome, but fundamentally they had been allies and had been faithful auxiliaries. They had provided always mostly this archery. They were famously enough the Palmyrani Sagittari, that Hadrian, for example, called during some crisis on the Danube, that framed properly into units of numeri. There were Palmyran troops stationed in North Africa, Roman settlements, garrisons, that were also that also maintained, seemingly in that case, an important ethnic distinction. Right, it was apparently an effort. That other troops were founded with that ethnic idea of, that they took the name from the people where they had recruited, but eventually they diluted because other people from everywhere in the empire came to join. It seems the Palmyrans were quite proud of their identity, and also what occurred, in fact, in the 3rd century crisis, after the death of King Odenathus that had destroyed the powerful Persian army, but with his widow, the famous Septimia Bat Zabdai, better known as Zenobia, reflects the greatness, the ambition, the aggressiveness, right, of this power that had also intervened in favor of the Romans, for example, to crush the Jewish revolts. It was a warlike power, like all powers were at the time, fundamentally, but evenly endowed with some ambitions that stand out in this also frightening and beautiful depictions of the local gods of war, right? Bearing Semitic Arab names, for example, and but still, it's evident then in the elite there was a great effort to be Romanized, to look Hellenistic enough, but they surely had this definitely oriental shade that made them quite exotic in nature, but more properly, and this is important to stress, Persian, right? If you look at depictions, we have also in Dura Europos frescoes, because here we can't say properly that just because the object of representation is Roman, that this hasn't to do with the local elites, with the local auxiliary troops, etc. In fact, there are also some archaeological finds of entire Palmyrene killed soldiers that are equipped dramatically similarly to the full mailed and male hooded troops in the Dura Europos frescoes. They also document, for example, the presence of an important infantry in Palmyra as well, and that up to that point, as we've seen, had provided troops to Rome, but had mostly coped with this eastern frontier that, as you know, was never particularly tranquil. In general, it was the most important of Rome itself. So there doesn't seem to be any particular, say, evidence of a Roman or an Hellenic influence in panoply, if not maybe something in armor, even in style, which is obvious, right? Most of what we see is Persian looking, right? It could be Parthian, could be Sassanid, throughout all this period. Palmyra could also rely on the mobilization of an important amount of Bedouin forces, right, from the Arab desert, that in this sense connect Palmyra with this broader movement that eventually is, in a long run perspective, I don't know, even what happened with Islamic invasions, for example, these Bedouin tribes that lived at the outskirts of civilization, and that always tried to exploit fundamentally a local instability to fight for plunder and so on. This is important because we have an important evidence of properly of an Arab connection with these military cultures, right? Not already at this point with some pictures we have properly Arab horse archers. This is very fascinating, and the Bedouin life was already there. Right, there is a bit of debate on this, let's say, but aside from the Samba, from the great southern Arabian civilization that collapsed around the late empire, as you know, with the destruction of the Marib Dam and the Long Run, these things, of course, some instability increased in the area. There was probably, that's eventually how both the Romans and the Sassanids settled in their respectively eastern and western frontier, in turn respectively the Sassanids and the Lakhmids, and therefore what we tend to periodize, for historiographical reasons, etc. Even when you look at material culture, military practice, etc., you realize these things had always been there, right? The same dynamics, the same warfare, same equipment, the same contacts among these peoples, and surely what stands out is the problem that the Palmyran army posed to the same Romans that were eventually capable of defeating them, and that especially Battle of Imai, and that where the Romans managed essentially to get rid of the Palmyran cataphracts, seemed to be the most frightening thing. It doesn't, however, have to make us forget that the actual bulk of Palmyran forces were horse archers. Not that cataphracts originally, even from the steppes, etc., had a moment in which they hadn't properly split the archer and the cataphract. That's something that eventually came to an end for reasons of simply of evolution of these military systems that made it render it more effective to split the two figures from in more advanced military systems in general, for sake of combined armed forces, and that were properly a problem, not just for the Romans, but a bit for everybody, where these men were not just, using missile weapons, etc., but were quite quick and skilled at moving in these semi-desertic areas that naturally were more difficult to march through logistically, were also less rich. Their occupation was not as important as, in fact, occupying this important urban centers in proximity of the oases, and so on, but from which naturally these groups could start, guerrilla warfare, etc. And as we know, a horse archery there has a great game, let's say, a great play, because of its agility and this capacity of hitting and running very speedily, and literally leaving out there in the desert. So we're as we were saying before, we're not dramatically informed about how this whole thing existed. We just know that the Romans appreciated very much Palmyran archers, and that naturally their tactical employment varied on the base of the enemy that they were meant to face, right? And they, not differently from other, also neighboring archery communities famous for their archery skills, right? The Palmyran cavalry included properly also camel troops. That we know that there were some, stratagems also tied to them. Sometimes you see, enemy troops entering concealed into sacks brought by camels into cities, things like that. That had always existed. Were just adapting to their own means. And Palmyra seems to have made an important use of also properly of horses that were in parts a bit like the same of the most important breeding centers in the area that were in the northwest of Palmyra in Syria proper, but also of Persian breeds. Seemingly. So this contact with these is very important, and there is a great similarity proper with Persian military culture in many ways. At some point when the Palmyrans invaded the Roman Near East, they also coerced the Third Roman Legion in their ranks, right? So these guys fought alongside the Palmyrans, and eventually they rebelled to them when the Romans arrived, and the war was brought properly in the area. But it's important to stress, even in here, the influence that surely these communities had received from this more advanced military systems, such as the Roman one, the Sassanid one, and this is why Palmyra is remarkable. It's being compared a bit to Greek Sparta in a sense, because normally individual city-states at this point, as you know, didn't quite perform dramatically well. Right? Rome had an important, had surely relied importantly on even urban militias. It's something that is often overlooked, like many areas, especially in this broader Hellenistic world, had retained large autonomies, conditions of freedom, because the important there was just for everything to work smoothly in terms of trade, of communications, etc. So the autonomy of these cities was important because, the more money they made, the more the Romans could cash through tolls and things like this, and there was no worry that individual centers could challenge, even with their militias, the Roman military. Like you have this dots of basically non-professional troops that are basically garrisoning these cities on their own, policing them, etc. Under the Roman, the local rulers that are under Rome. These cities do not have much of an interland, right? So this was typical in Hellenism, and the only ones we have large estates properly functionalized for the sake of the maintenance of a large professional military was the empire, right? So in case of need of emergency, this is evident also in the East, right? The Romans gathered everything they found in terms of, they had Roman legions there plus auxiliary units, but they also gathered all these militias or mercenaries, whatever. But individually they didn't have much of an autonomy. Instead, Palmyra accomplished the fact, of course, was on the eastern frontier, was the most exposed, mentally to also this increasingly aggressive Persian threat towards the 3rd century. Well, it probably acquired a large enough autonomy and capacity to field also these important armies. Naturally, they exploited Rome's crisis at that point, so it's relatively easy if the center is florid and the rest is basically a pacified Roman province to if the Roman government there collapsed, to take over just even with small forces. But it's still remarkable in the measure in which they properly believed they could take over the area. Right, during the 3rd century crisis, you have these major problems, with the Germanic invasions, the separation of the so-called Gallic Empire. But you see, differently from Palmyra, and this is notorious, the Gallic Empire was not a seceded state, right? They were just basically the same Romans there saying, okay, we are from this side of the empire, we are interested in the local government and administration. We have to defend the Rhine frontier from the Alemanni, from other peoples, and that's pretty much it, right? Eventually Aurelian intervened also there, brought things in order, but it was not a threat to the solidity of the empire. Palmyra was instead, because it was not a Roman power, it was not integrated, it was not part of the same mindset. They had basically survived as an autonomous power at the outskirts of the empire. As soon as there was a weakness, they thought, quite boldly to take over, right? And literally, because these were the richest areas of the empire at this point, and improving in a sense the same fragility. I mean, the fact that the Sassanids, for example, could invade Roman Syria and succeed, being stopped by the Palmyrans, tells also that the crisis of the Roman military at that point had reached an important dimension, or at least, contingentally speaking, things like these could happen and cause serious trouble. So until Palmyra wasn't brought down by Aurelian, that restored the world in this sense, the unity of the empire, there was a it was a doomed properly, this is how it seemed, generally speaking, enterprise. Like there wasn't much of a chance that Palmyra could stand against whatever would have happened to the empire. Of course, they were betting against against its unity for the Roman Empire disgregation, but it was bold to say the least, right? And things, in fact, ended the way we know. So I would say, what's a stereotypical Palmyran archer? Well, he's a guy that probably doesn't it doesn't even necessarily belong properly to the Palmyran city itself, and lives in the outskirts, in these farms, or maybe even out there in these communities around. He was summoned under the call of the city, therefore in part might have been paid, in part for loot, and he would wear habitually the standard Palmyran dress. Remember, there isn't much difference, actually no difference, between the civilian and military costume, the dress properly meant. A longish tunic with contrasting bands at the throat down the center of the front, right around the hem, and usually at the cuffs as well. And similar bands would run down the front of each leg, right? There could be a cap or not. This also depends on how armored or conceptually this guy had to be in a way, but it doesn't make a tremendous difference because this archer is mostly a light trooper, right? These guys are in the infantry, the foot archers, not meant to withstand another infantry or even less cavalry charge. Same horse archers are all about hit and run. They do not come at close to hand-to-hand combat because they would normally lose. So it's just about actually the power of their bows that altogether can throw this volley and keep harassing the enemy, sometimes even with what are called the Cantabrian tactics of essentially maintaining the enemy under constant fire, right? Whether it was actually carried out more often probably by hitting back and forth from the ranks, different, let's say, handfuls of horsemen, and or with this circle that would throw at the extreme toward the enemy line, the arrows in continuity. That was the main deal. And as we've seen, these bows were quite important. They could have a draw of 30-35 kilos, something like that. I mean, if some have been probably measured from the archaeological finds with something like 60-70 pounds, which is not a few, right? And the appearance also, maybe really want to make a wargamistic matter of color, right? What they would like, normally they had, we see it from tomb paintings, that men were dressed in the same two colors, but sometimes reversed. So some has taken this as evidence of a uniform or something like that, which is possible. We're talking about uniforms just the other day, the fact that there wasn't any standardization in modern sense, but still, some colors, even for identity reason, for valor, for belonging to one client, one family, etc., they would provide this kind of similar pattern. This is important also for, especially when you have very mobile tactics. Sometimes you want to recognize what unit is that. For this reason, a Palmyran uniform, let's say, for example, officers would be a maroon tunic with dark greenish blue bands and greenish blue trousers with maroon bands, and the rankers reverse these colors, for example. And the saddle clothes were the opposite color to the trousers, right? And such leather work as belts, scabbards, quivers, and horse trappings always maroon, as far as we see. Always doesn't mean much, but still prevalently so. And a bow would be carried in a separate case rather than in a combined bow case and quiver, right? And archery here means still, you could be equipped with a spear and a sword. Also, very common was a small round shield. We find it even for the best armored troops, because naturally the more the arm, the more, and the less the shield. Not always, right? Look at Roman legionnaires at that point, but it depended also on what these guys had to be. There was a lot of equestrian culture, as you understand. So the idea we get here, of course, for archers, for lighter troops, the having a large shield wasn't that important, right? These troops had to be mobile, had to be quick, so even having large shields wasn't this important. Presumably infantry would have that to have a sort of of screen, also maybe for the same archers, because at the end of the day most archery would be at best employed against packed formations of enemy infantrymen, such as Roman legionnaires that were at this point, of course, as always, actually prevalently infantry. We have other evidence with those aforementioned tunics with different colors that we see from these paintings. It could be white, right? Sometimes dyed in a contrasting color. Cloaks would be there. I'm thinking in the desert there are, as you know, very sharp thermic excursions, and these men were used to live in the wilderness in part on a daily basis, so they knew better how to help preserving their own body temperature from day and night and these extremes. They would be like in dark natural colors, right, or dyed in some dark shade of some sort. There could be also a variant of the usual dress with plain trousers, tunic split up to the side, and bands up the split instead of one up the center. As troopers, as we were saying before, it would have not been so strange to see archers equipped with some kind of offensive weapon or even armor. Right, this, as we've seen, is not standard. There were the least probably of the troops that did that. But let's say here we're talking always in general proximate terms, and there would always be some sort of also offensive capability, which is something you find more often in fact in Persian warfare since ancient, older times than these, and it was kept remaining. This kind of hyper specialization of the individual trooper that point would be kind of a medium infantry rather than a mere skirmisher. But the idea that you can pass from bow to spear is something that think about the Persian immortals. Well, look, those were elites, right? But that's a kind of trooper we kept being documented quite often, not just on foot, but probably on horseback, because basically, that's always an option, right? Having a spear that allows you to charge the enemy, even with lighter troops, is always useful, because you wouldn't do that with heavier troops, but since there are a lot of lighter troops as you are around, well, if you have to chase them, especially they're usually to be a lot, so you can kill a lot of them if you pursue them, and you don't just have a dagger with you. You want to have, yes, a spear together with an arrow. And this naturally reflected in general however, the broader philosophy of combined arms that these peoples mostly performed against the enemy, this constant wearing out of the enemy, avoiding, protracting the engagement, let's say, and avoiding close contact until the enemy was exhausted. Right, which might have been a reason why, for example, the Romans also managed to defeat the heavier Palmyran cavalry in the form of cataphracts, because also think about in the desert what it means to use something like that. But that might have come simply because of Roman tactical superiority of another kind, right? We have seen that also Roman cataphracts didn't have much fortune in general, even against lighter troops. Their cataphracts are a problem in general, and they here Palmyra probably, yes, as we've seen, they had cataphract troops in the sense of in the etymological Greek sense of armored troops, but not entirely the ultra heavy klibanari, like you find it. Those were something extremely expensive, were an asset just properly a larger state normally could afford. It's what or a particularly hierarchized tribal culture, like the one of the steppes at some levels. There is an interesting evolution, even in the Persian armies, proper towards a gradual lightening of the cataphracts towards, however, bit the later centuries, right? This maybe was the moment of their apex, in a sense. So maybe, yes, Palmyra could have, because this is not really a matter of having the resources to keep one guy, right? But of course, the collective effect has to have a lot of them together, which, however, costs an atrocious lot, right? Altogether more than even than the sum than the individual gather, because you have to manage the entire unit, and as a system, mathematically disperses more easily its energy, and it's something you have to invest, right? And probably Palmyra didn't have any of this. That is to say, that's more something only an empire could afford. So I'm not entirely sure, because I've never studied in detail, but we will do it on Schwerpunkt, what the actual Palmyran military quality was, right? What is astonishing is what they rather managed to do in the vacuum of Roman power in the Near East. But it's still remarkable to see, however, how, in the moment, as it always has, the moment of evaporation of a certain power locally, there's immediately somebody was ready to fill that gap, and the Palmyrans did it, in a very aggressive, very determined way. So credit to Zenobia, especially for this, this capacity proper, well, what can I say more? These videos are they come a bit out like this, right? They're a bit stereotypical in a sense, because how can we distinguish a Palmyran archer from a Roman archer on the eastern frontier, right? Or on a, or a Sasanian archer? Surely there are some shades, some details that you can say, oh, look, here we have found, of course, the Palmyran statues, etc. Well, they tell us this, yeah, but you see even in there that they were pretty similar to other peoples, right? So there's nothing specifically Palmyran, as there's nothing specifically Roman, as specifically Sassanid, right? It is just material culture spread, that gravitates, that revolves around, is blended, is improved. Yeah, we can find some dynamics here and there to identify, to characterize, but fundamentally we're the same thing. We can imagine in general that skill in archery derived for these peoples mostly from I'm not sure whether necessarily a systematic archer's training, right? This is possible. I mean, I'm pretty sure that Palmyra had, a solid, but we will talk about the Palmyran army organization specifically, but, they surely, they did have this solid, properly city contingents of archers that were surely trained. They had their weapons installed. They worked for the, for the big guys, right? For the kings, and they surely were employed also properly. They would be equipped to be sent in service of Rome to show also how rich this place was and how much the Romans had to be mindful and thankful about this, right? But overall, what actually made these communities good archers was properly the environment in which they were framed, right? As most these in the areas, you have to imagine this rich cities and these important trade routes, the Silk Road, separated by important distances, like of tens, if not hundreds of kilometers, with these dots, oases, where these cities properly stood, and caravan routes in the middle. So all those guys that lived scattered in the wilderness around were essentially brigands that harassed these trade lines, and with this archery, kind of guerrilla style tactical capacity that they learned just for a living, right? Also at home, as kind of think as shepherds, guys had to live in a certain way, and surely also the broader. And obviously the broader exposure to important, what was becoming properly a superpower, was Persia at this point under the Sassanids, would require a complement of archer to cope with. But generally speaking, it was just part of the local culture, as it was since millennia, as far as we understand, in Mesopotamia, in terms of archery skills. And think about the Assyrians, what they had. I mean, these places were traditionally about archery. Right, and probably a lot has to do. I mean, I don't want to say things that are too mechanistic, but even consider the weather here, right? even wearing armor is a challenge sometimes under the Syrian sun. In summer, in the good season, you literally cook yourself inside the armor. So usually, yes, we think as far as for Roman equipment, in a sense, a bit on the eastern frontiers being hypothesized, it could be lighter because of probably of this exhaustion deriving from probably the environments where these guys fought to be lighter, like leather or something like that. So in this picture, it's not strange that the majority of troops were conceived also as lighter, more likely armored, and therefore bows would have a greater importance, right? Because they would kill more easily, and this is a bit the general custom of the region as it had been. And of course there were armored troops, both cavalry and infantry, as we have seen, but stereotypically there were less in relative terms, right, than, say, Roman infantry that at this point was still all kind of armored, or at least, well, this is a bit maybe a prejudice too, because the Romans also had, especially at this point, were starting to differentiate, to invest more in combined tactics, so they didn't care too much about the uniformity of the heavy infantry. That at this point doesn't mean much even in it, because before they had the auxiliaries that compensated for those tactical functions. Now there were the birthplace of auxiliaries were being gentrified and absorbed. So by the 3rd century, we've seen it with the Simmarcari, etc. Romans now were mostly trying to either hire people from outside the Roman boundaries and becoming dependent on them. So maybe reliance even on centers like Palmyra would be something. But properly to have an army that now they have to overall, however, properly the regular one, recruit from the whole empire. It can't be just about heavy infantry. Now, the same Roman citizens / subjects at this point have to provide for the other tactical specialties, and this is often mistaken for, you see, now the Romans had less armored troops. Well, yeah, because now they didn't have the less armored ones that they had always had in the form of auxiliaries that they would essentially integrate during the War of Expansions that had basically finished. And so it's not really a much of a less of an account. But we see surely that, stereotypically the Roman legion would be better armored than, let's say, than an eastern one, at least from the properly the evenness of the distribution of armor among the various troops on average. Whereas eastern troops mostly had this ultra heavy elite, both numerically and tactically, and then swarms of basically also unarmored troops. And this is the deal that in general you find even in the Middle Ages, still with Europeans and Turks, Crusaders and Turks, and that's due to particular profile of European communities, what they were composed by, what kind of wealth distribution they had. But this in practice wouldn't make this huge difference on the field. I mean, these systems were winning or losing whether because they were more or less politically powerful, right? Not really how they practically fought, because they tendentially came to be eminently, to be very tendent towards symmetry. Albeit we should always say that Rome maintained always a tactical standard, was capable actually of coping with all these threats. So that, especially the Constantinian reforms, produced something that, for a good century, was able to cope with the greatest tactical threats and defeating them, right? So Romans did maintain a higher standard of superiority on the longer run in this context. And the same fall of Palmyra is, at that point, is to be read in this broader international balance, but which is obvious, it's just one city standing against an empire, but it's also contingental to the instability of the eastern frontier, this internal crisis of the empire, not simply because they were, more or less militarily capable. That's how I see things, because there is a historiography that says basically, that these were probably some kind of more warlike society with good army that we have probably that we don't understand how strong it was. Well, I'm not sure there is this kind of evidence, because armies in general are strong, right? It's just when politics is weak that armies become weak. But the formulas, the equipment, the training, well, that's something that, you know, in a standard situation is good, and that's because otherwise you wouldn't even go at war with it. So, yeah, probably at this point Palmyra was facing a good political and social balance. They managed to seize this opportunity, but eventually also they lost the bat. And however, Palmyran units continued to serve in the Roman army even after, for a long time, right? Forever, kind of, as long as the Romans remained in the area. So certain things never really changed, right? As we were saying before, these eastern units were to be found since the beginning of the early empire in the Roman army here and there. So there's really enough to strain. People have guessed some of the archers on Trajan's column could be, you know, this kind of either the Turans or this broader Syrian, the Semitic auxiliaries that were famous for their archery skills. As you know, in parts there is a broader debate that is not every auxiliary archer you see on Roman monuments it's necessarily even an Easterner, right? It could be an Easterner in form even of a Balkanic sometimes. Which is often overlooked, especially if you look at the stereotypical, what you see, the Syrian archer. We made a video actually on that, saying, they looked like that. Well, that kind of armor basically was present everywhere, from the Sarmatian steppes to, in fact, to Arabia. There's nothing specifically, you know, just Syrian about that. The same goes for bows, archery in general, and surely from the broader eastern part of the empire, this better troop that had composite bows were, as we've seen, more apt to properly archery warfare, more habituated to it. They had more skills. So, well, would be said as good ethnic component. That's tactical specialty of missile troops in the Roman army, but you know, it's also pretty standard. All right, so for now we stop it here. I tried to throw stuff in so that the video could be less disappointing, but I promise we will talk about other types of Palmyran troops. You know that this is what we do here. Basically, we take every kind of iconic troop, not even iconic, because iconic is just, I don't know, Spartan, hoplite, all of the. No, here we want to be encyclopedical about every kind of trooper you could find, kind of more or less characterizably. So. In this case, yeah, we're talking about Roman times, but also we start from Hellenistic times. We would like to widen back again to classical times because we did it at the beginning, but we kind of stopped for reasons that I have to that I explained in part. And also for the Middle Ages in the entirety. So we're full of stuff to say about cataphracts, about like cavalry, about of the Palmyrans and their military organization and battles that the Romans fought against them. So yeah, there's and plus the average manual, let's say Roman history manual lessons about, you know, what happened with the 3rd century crisis, Odenatus, Zenobia, and so on. For now, we however stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.